course, throwing away a lot of good food, the idea of getting rid of overproduction, like they killed 50,000 cows and pigs and burnt the carcasses to limit the production, which makes no sense at all at a time where people were starving, but also shows the complexities of running different things kind of from scratch. But it worked pretty fast. Farm prices did begin to go up, and even though there was clearly a large numbers of farm foreclosures in this area here, farm prices would stabilize. The money would come from a tax on food processors who can food, that sort of thing. But sharecroppers did not get money. The money went to the landlords, and the landlords pocketed it. And by the end of the 1930s, most of the sharecroppers were kicked off of their land. And this is going to lead to a second Great Migration. Remember, there was the first Great Migration from about 1910 through 1919. People leaving the South and going north. These massive internal migration. And most people associate that with the Dust Bowl, people leaving farms because driven up by drought. Actually, most were sharecroppers kicked off their farm. And they went to big cities in the north, or a lot went to big cities in, this poor map is nearing the end, it's barely holding on, but in California, that sort of thing. The problem was, the food processors did not want to pay this tax. There would be a lawsuit about the price controls because of this, and the Supreme Court would find the AAA unconstitutional. There would be a second AAA, and that'd be in 1938, which we'll get to in just a little bit. And so, the first big attempt, but there's one important thing about Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration. They desperately wanted to save at least the remnants of small farmers. And that would be the position of the United States, that the federal government was going to try to subsidize small farms from 1933 to 1973. In 1973, the United States totally abandoned that and very consciously tried to get rid of small farms, which was basically successful by the 1980s. To pretty horrific results if you go to rural Montana, for example. And so with that, the TVA. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a massive public works program. It created jobs building dams in the Tennessee River and Columbia River Valley. These were some of the poorest areas in the country. The South was dirt poor. And it provided electricity, flood control, dams. All these red lines are dams all through the Columbia and Tennessee River system. And the first thing was flood control, irrigation, but massive hydroelectric power plants. And there's a reason why the first uranium separating, the big centrifuges that would separate uranium for the first atomic bomb would be right here because of all the dams and hydroelectric power. The first nuclear reactor would be at Richland, Washington because of the dams. Don't drink the water in the Tri-Cities area. But this combined with the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, which still functions today, this would bring electricity to the 40% of the population who had access to no electricity at all. None. So the cooperative in Great Falls, who does electricity around Great Falls, that was an REA project. So rural areas, that's part of the New Deal to get electricity because it's building the power lines, et cetera, is very expensive, and companies did not want that capital expense because they wouldn't make enough money. And so here the federal government made kind of a private-public cooperation. This was Roosevelt's one of his proudest achievements. If you go to the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., which near the FDR Memorial, near the Lincoln Memorial, one of the most prominent areas is the TVA. It has a kind of a dam and this cascading waterfall. You walk through the New Deal, well done memorial, but they did not think of the environmental impact and the problems of long-term hydroelectric power. It begins to silt up with all the sediments in the water, and will eventually can clog up the rivers. So there's a long-term issue with hydroelectric power. And then the other environmental issues with dams and not flooding and what that does to fish and wildlife. So with that, also, this includes, and we jump right into massive public works. So all we need to know the initials. The CCC we've already mentioned, but two other big programs, the PWA, the Public Works Administration, just know the initials, and the CWA, the Civil Works Administration. And here's a Grand Coulee Dam. These are relatively small programs, but the idea was provide jobs, now get money in the economy, but also build things like roads and schools and bridges, or just clean up parks and clean up streets, etc. So some of it was kind of make work. Most of it was building things like, for example, the courthouse. Part of our courthouse in Helena was, or the city hall in Helena is CWA, and a couple of the dams in the Missouri nearby are PWA. This is not the big public works. Now, public works is what everybody called it. Infrastructure is a relatively new term. In fact, nobody would have ever used the term infrastructure in 50 years ago. And now it's used all the time. But public work just means the federal government, taxpayer money providing jobs, but the big thing is on roads, schools, etc. That could be used for economic growth and a better life down the road. We also argue some of them might not be good, but that's the goal of it. One of the most important reform regulations, though, a huge one would be Glass-Steagall. The Glass-Steagall Act, these are two members of Congress, and relatively conservative. They realized we needed regulation of the banking system, or who knows what will happen if people who might be more socialist or fascist get into power. Glass-Steagall is one of the most influential laws in American history. It regulated the banking system. The biggest one they did is separate investment banks, which are the big Wall Street banks, which did investment in Wall Street or helped set up corporations. They did that, and commercial banks. Commercial banks are those local banks down the road. They do loans. They're the ones you put if you have a savings account, you put it in a commercial bank. Investment banks are the Wall Street banks. What was happening in the 1920s, also happened in the 1890s, we see this other times, banks were using the commercial side. Deposits from regular depositors, working people, whatever it might be, who put their money in a savings account, and using that to speculate in the stock market. And that would blow up both sides. So they said this will be separate. See, isn't this an exciting graphic? Isn't that great? And a very important part of this would be the FDIC, a public-private corporation. So it's kind of both federal government, but has some private elements that will insure deposits. Every bank who wants this insurance, they have to pay a premium, and they have to agree to bank inspectors. But by advertising, you notice every advertisement for a bank, or if you walk into a bank, you see this prominently on the bank, FDIC. It's telling their depositors, your deposit is safe. So even if the bank goes under, your deposit, at least most of it, is insured. And what this does, it avoids the panic on the banks. So we talked about the bank panics. Even healthy banks would be destroyed by that panic. Once FDIC came, combined with this more stable, regulated, very boring bank system, bank failures ended. Just ended. And banking became a really boring occupation. Now, boring as in just kind of constant profit, but not really the chance for big speculation or big busts. And this led to, arguably, 50 years of stability. And this graph really shows it. These are bank failures. And look at 32, how many banks in the United States fail. And look at the impact of Glass-Steagall. Just no bank failures. And this would be the way it was until, there was deregulation, when they took the same kind of regulations off these things. A former bank called Savings and Loans in the 1980s. And they all blew themselves up, so they're gone now. And then in 1999, bankers have been lobbying for years because speculation means they can make a lot of money, also lose money. And in 1999, Glass-Steagall was gutted. They would allow for these banks to unify. FDIC remained. but most of the regulations don't. In fact, they also specifically said they couldn't regulate certain types of financial instruments. And so this is 1999. There had been no financial panics in the United States from 1929 until 1999. And so what they were told is they'll never happen again. They've learned their lesson. It took them less than a decade to blow up the world's financial system, which I would argue that's pretty good, isn't it? Less than a decade? I would have thought 12, 13 years. Yes, there was a massive financial panic in 2008. And there was a cry in 2009. I can still vividly remember this. Bring back this, so there'll be no more panics. But they make too much money. So effective lobbying. I should add, when we're talking about a little bit of liberal and conservative, this, to get rid of this was a pretty conservative idea. But there was a conservative Democrat, Bill Clinton, and that's what he pushed for. A lot of Democrats joined them, and all Republicans to pass. And then a relatively economically conservative Democrat named Barack Obama, who was your second president. You've had 4 presidents in your lifetime, right? He did not want to bring that back. So to continue that policy of relative deregulation. We're just finishing up a unit on this on special topics about the 2008 crash. And so with that, Glass-Steagall. I was actually kind of surprised. I really thought they'd bring it back. But, so what it means is look for a bubble. If there's a bubble, like prices are really going high in some kind of speculative asset, that's when you start worrying about a financial panic. And I see no bubbles anywhere. That's me lying to you. What is there a bubble in? Huh? Yeah, which is just pure speculative and or money laundering thievery. And what's the other one? Yeah, real estate. I don't know if it's enough, but that's what you look for. Look for bubbles. Bubbles crash. Just because that's what's going to happen. You start seeing them just start funneling money in. Did I say money? Funneling money. Next, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So this would be a regulatory body that would regulate the stock market. And one of the big things they demanded was transparency. Companies would have to put out quarterly reports for a year, and they must tell the truth. I know, I just blew your mind. They must tell the truth about how much money they actually made, their revenues. And this would have formally banned like secret agreements and secret little deals. Like, hey, we're about ready to come out with a new product. Invest today because tomorrow our stock price is going up. This is now known as insider trading. That used to be perfectly legal. Yes, they still lie about it, and this is a massive issue. They also try to strengthen the margin rules. And so here's my picture of this. This passed in 34. It was hard even with vast majorities in the Democratic-controlled Congress to get this passed. So that's what this cartoon is about. And well, when the SEC was pretty strict on controlling this, and when the banking industry was still pretty heavily regulated, the stock market never reached the numbers of 1929 until the go-go 60s, they called it. And then it still stayed relatively stable until they basically ended the regulation in the 1980s, and then the stock market is just boom. It's speculative boom. A lot of speculation. And so it gets back to the thing is a regulatory body is only as strong as the people who regulate. And so if a president is not very pro-regulation, they'll put in people who aren't very pro-regulation. If they're very pro-regulation, they'll put some people who are. So next, one of the big was getting off the gold standard. If you're tied to the gold standard, you can't inflate or deflate your currency. You can't put money in the economy. Roosevelt made an executive order getting off the gold standard. And once he announced that allowed the Federal Reserve to pump money into the economy, inflate the currency, expand it. They want the value of money to drop so prices begin to go up, and that will encourage production. Put money into people's hands. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it's one of many ways to get the economy going. And since it's no longer tied to an artificial measure, this is what we call today fiat currency, where the value of the currency is decided or is maintained by the good standing of the government that issues it. That the government can collect taxes, enforce its laws, and keep the wealth in its country. If the tax code, if the tax code collapses and people believe that governments can no longer collect taxes, the currency will collapse. That happened in 1929 in Germany. Some of you might have heard of the hyperinflation there, with that inflation of 1,000% a day. People think inflation now is bad. Imagine 1,000% a day. Well, that's what happened there. It happened in Zimbabwe in 1993. It happened in Venezuela in 6 years ago. So the United States would go off the gold standard. It went off partially back on the gold standard in 47, and then completely off in 1971. And so now it is completely controlled by the Federal Reserve, which is a much more stable way. When you're tied to something artificial, it bounces up with that value. And that allowed them to pump the money supply. So here's Roosevelt's gold standard drop. Roosevelt did it temporarily, but actually go all the way through, technically through today. These colored lines show us what happened to all these economies. These are major powers: Japan, Britain, Germany, US, and France, when they got off the gold standard. And this is just one of many reasons, but Japan's economy went right off the gold standard. Britain, Germany, US, France, as a source of pride, did not go off the gold standard. This would be a big deal when they were trying to rearm at the end of the 1930s and they didn't have money. Be a really big crisis. I don't know what's going to happen at the end of the 1930s. Something like that. Something will happen. A slight war. Next, intensely antitrust, anti-monopoly, especially at the end of the New Deal. And so you might remember this law. They're going to enforce the still really horribly written civil law of the land today, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And also really aggressively have the FTC, which was created during the Wilson administration, to control mergers, to not allow companies to merge. And that's companies that have certain market share have to go to the FTC to this day. And the whole idea about this would be, by competition will drive prices down, encourage innovation, and also wages go up if there's more companies competing for workers. Monopolies cut wages, period. And here is, I love this cartoon, so I had to show it. Here's Teddy Roosevelt, the ghost of Teddy Roosevelt now. Kind of creepy, but not too bad, right? Looking approvingly on his cousin, FDR, for antitrust. You know, the trust buster, agreeing with him. And that's the height of progressive policies. So under Roosevelt, he would call that liberal. We're allowing for capitalism, but we're going to make sure there's competition. And beginning about 1978 is a key year. Conservative Democrat by the name of Jimmy Carter basically started deregulating what's called the trucking industry. Why do they call it what's called? I think you know what trucks are. But it started with deregulation of the trucking industry, next year with deregulation of the airline industry. But once you saw that, through today now, we are dominated by monopolies. And for the first time since 78, there is a president who used to be all for monopolies, but now he's appointed people that aren't quite as pro monopolies. I wonder what direction we're going. I really don't know. This is kind of an interesting little, you guys are in good times. Actually, we're on the cusp of change, and I don't know, or maybe we're in the middle of it, but we're on the cusp of something. It's interesting. I'm old, so I can act like I'm looking back at it. I'm old. In fact, we were just talking about the parade, Mr. Larson and I, we both looked at each other and said, just saying how old we are. I've been doing the parade since 1921. 1921. Back then, to stop the juniors and seniors from having a brawl. which I'm all for bringing back. Who's with me? We just open the field up and we just say brawl. I get a seat, comfy chair. Moving on, somebody would complain, right? Right? Somebody. The FHA. The FHA was this, it's such an interesting program. The FHA would provide mortgage insurance to people and would be incredibly successful to try to convince people to buy a home. So mortgage insurance means if you can't pay back your mortgage, it's something that the insurance will provide that for the banks. And most people could not afford the down payment on buying a home. And they couldn't afford the mortgage insurance, which was incredibly high. This will provide the insurance at really low rates. And the whole idea was to encourage home ownership. Now, it wasn't just to have the home. It was also, that would encourage construction, that would encourage jobs in that measure too. And also protect banks. And so by 2005, it depends on where you look, anywhere from 40 to 65% of families had a home. It depends on how they designate that. That'd be the peak of home ownership in the United States. It was 2005. Yes, there was a bubble, and that's soon going to bring down the whole economy. It's not the fact that people bought homes, but there was a housing bubble. And that's a big deal. Put this out for people, and you combine this with after the war, one of the big wartime initiatives of Roosevelt was called the GI Bill, to provide not only college, but also money for veterans to buy homes. All part of the FHA. My wife and I's first home was, we got an FHA. That's a big deal the first time you buy a home. Because before this, most people had to put down 50% down payment for a home. Most people could not afford 50% down payment. Now, almost no one can afford a 50% down payment. You don't have $500,000 sitting around. I mean, I know you probably do, burning a hole in your pocket, right? Is that a problem for any of you? Too much money in your pocket? This would allow for people to pay. And also, loans were like 15 years and went to 30 years. That's another story for down the road. One problem with this, though, is what areas will they decide to designate for insurance? And they're saying, hey, we're not going to allow insurance in some areas if they're like bad neighborhoods and the home might go down in value. And so they went through towns, every single town in the United States, and they made a map up, and it's going to be called redlining. And areas in red, there'd be no federal subsidy for mortgage insurance. So basically, they're telling the homes there, hey, you're not going to be able to sell your home and no one will buy it. Areas in yellow, better neighborhood. Areas in blue, very good neighborhoods. So what's going to happen to the values of home in areas they designated as red? Will they go up? Yes.
Nature trail.
Yeah, like a rock. And what's going to happen in homes that are blue? They'll go up. And yes, this was in Helena, but Helena was relatively small, so it didn't only have a few of these areas. But you see in big cities like here, it's Philadelphia. Massive out parts where they're basically saying, hey, home value is going to drop. But it also coincided, and it turned out to be quite conscious amongst the regulators. It wasn't in the law. It was basically areas that were segregated for mostly black neighborhoods, which were very segregated neighborhoods, or other minorities. So like in Los Angeles, there was areas that were majority Hispanic, for example. This was a major issue. And these were the redlining areas. And there's like a line. And in fact, they would go from blue to yellow in these cities if one black family moved into the neighborhood. And so there would be, like, oh, can't allow for property development, which, by the way, would encourage the growth of suburbs, but that's another story down the road. And the thing about this is it's going to help lead to poverty. Because the biggest source of wealth for most families is home. You know, for most people, it's their home, if they have a home. You know, that's one piece of wealth they can't get rid of. You can imagine what's going to happen. If you got a wealth that's low in or a home that's low in value, you're not going to pass a lot of wealth on to your children. And certainly nobody who bought a home, regardless of color or where they lived was, or especially the turnaround, fault about this. But this is going to lead to a really big long-term effects, really big long-term effects, because these did not end until 1968. And by then, the neighborhoods were set. It was the Civil Rights Act, also called the Fair Housing Act of 1968, kind of the last of Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Acts. And you'll see this is a wealth issue. And it's one that will have corrosive elements down the road. The average wealth of a white family is 10 times the average wealth of a black family in the United States today. It's about 9 times the wealth of an Hispanic family. And it's nothing to say either about the people who have the wealth or not the wealth. That's not even the point. The point is this has corrosive effects on the society. And it shows one of the flaws of the New Deal thinking about this. Basically what it was, we passed a law, moved on, we'll let other people administer it. But this gives you an idea how widespread this program was. This was everywhere. I love this, just the PWA, which was a relatively small public works program, but one's in Montana and all over. That's starting at Fort Peck Dam. So major programs. The results of the first New Deal, without a doubt, it brought confidence and the economy began to grow again. But it wasn't big enough. It was not big enough. So the economy began to grow, but long-term unemployment lingered, and that's the definition of the Depression. There's no real set number, it's just long-term unemployment. And it was coming to this pretty bad equilibrium. But this shows the GDP. This is a trend line. And this is the boom up to 29. Here's the crash, stabilization in 33, and then the economy began to grow. But it's still not enough. And this is the whole thing about what card does Roosevelt have next to do. Because in 34, it was clear, yes, the New Deal made people feel better, but expectations are going up. The economy is not quite meeting it. Because look at these unemployment figures. Okay, the bottom one's the real unemployment. That's adjusted for people who had like PWA jobs. So it was over 25%. And look at the drop by 34. It's still over 15%. That's a huge drop. But long-term unemployment lingered. And there were very vocal, oh, almost forgot this. All right, don't write everything down. There are 3 ways you'll see sometimes this will be done in textbooks, and the reason I have to tell you this is because you might see something like this on the AP exam. I'm of the school that think this is actually a not a great way of looking at the New Deal, but I have to show you these terms. So everybody write down relief, recovery, and reform. They'll divide the laws into this. And since I'm annoyed by this, I stole this chart from somebody else. And then by looking at it, I realized, boy, those 3 examples they have of relief, recovery, reform aren't good examples. So I'm gonna have to change this. It just bugs me because most of the programs have all 3. But relief was just direct relief for people who are suffering. That kind of makes sense. Recovery, get the economy going again. Reform to make sure you don't get another crash. So the best example of this, put an arrow or something like that, Glass-Steagall, to make sure there's not another bubble. Recovery, the best example of a recovery would be like the TVA. Getting jobs going, but that also led to reform, but recovery. Relief, FERA, the FERA. I mean, the CC, all these have elements of it, but I'm gonna have to change that. So everyone got that? Glass-Steagall is an example of that. So make sure it doesn't happen again. Get the economy moving, direct aid. But all these programs, all these 3 programs did all 3. So that's how. So I just had to introduce these terms because you might see that on the AP exam if you get a question about the New Deal. Any questions on that? The 3 R's? Yeah. So there were a lot of enemies of FDR. Arguably the most popular president in American history, but the enemies despised him. So the intensity of the hatred of him is kind of overwhelming. So he had a lot of very conservative or on the right who thought the 20s were great. Of course, they might have been relatively isolated, but they thought the 20s economy is good. This is a temporary depression and let the economy go again. And so they want to continue the trickle-down economics. And they believed in social Darwinism. If you help poor people, they will just drink it away. We saw that with Herbert Hoover definitely thought that. And they thought that he was acting almost like a king. Thus, you see King Roosevelt. You see the same things when they'll attack Andrew Jackson. You saw the same ones when the Abraham Lincoln wearing a crown. You see this a lot of times in history. And therefore, they were intensely anti-regulation, especially the antitrust, anti the direct aid, and direct aid raises wages. If you know that you won't starve to death because you leave a job that you hate, that gives you the opportunity to bargain for higher wages. And they really did not want progressive taxes. Really want to keep those tax cuts. If large incomes aren't taxed, that allows gives the ability to build wealth. And another issue, a lot of Southern conservative Democrats were very worried that Roosevelt might follow the lead of his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who pushed hard to get rid of Jim Crow laws and voting rights. Remember Jim Crow laws? Roosevelt didn't do that, but Roosevelt did, for example, ban discrimination in government jobs and toyed with, but his generals convinced him he couldn't do it, integrating the Army. That wouldn't be done until after the war. So they thought he might do it. And so immediately the brand was he was a communist, or a red, or a Bolshevik. So you see Roosevelt's New Deal, and I said, it says here, leave out the joker. And it shows socialist experiments. And you might notice that picture, that kind of looks like the bomb-throwing anarchist picture I showed you in the past. So he's a communist. They said the same thing about Teddy Roosevelt, too, that he was a communist. And I'll get to what the communists thought of him in a second. But another big thing was that he was a traitor to his class. And this was said over and over again. Roosevelt was from old-time patrician wealth. His descendants were Roosevelt's. They came from the Netherlands. They first scooped up land along the Hudson River back in the 17th century, and Britain would take it right here. Big estate, massive old-time family, old patroon family. And they saw him as a traitor. How dare he do this? And the intensity of hatred of some of the wealthiest people in the United States is kind of shocking. And that really came to me. I will never forget watching this. It was 1991. And I was watching this show. To be honest, I don't even know if it's still on. But it's called 2020. They had this really famous interviewer on ABC called Barbara Walters. She would interview famous politicians, business people, celebrities, really well-known person. And a pretty impressive person, Barbara Walters. At the time, only men did that. So she was an impressive person. But she was interviewing Barbara Bush. Now, Barbara Bush was the first lady, and George H.W. Bush was president, and that was at a time, 91, the height of his popularity. And by the way, some of you might know her. She passed away a few years ago, but who she is, it was her son was president when you were born. And this is an old-time family. The Bush family, old wealth, old financial family. George H.W. Bush's father was a senator and made his fortune on Wall Street in the 1920s. But they had old wealth before that. Just an old wealth, Patricia family, just the way life is. And Barbara Bush was a Pierce. Not only old wealth, her great-great-grandfather was, remember Franklin Pierce, who was president in the 1850s? Remember that term? Remember that name? Yes or no? Kind of? Well, she was really popular. She just put a book about her dog out and stuff. Really popular. Well, every first lady, they compare to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was probably the most influential first lady. Really the first one. She's so actively fighting for civil rights, women's rights, the rights of working people. But so I was talking to Barbara Bush, and on those softball interviews, and they asked her, "Hey, do you?" A lot of people have compared you to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she immediately bristled. No, no, we do not mention that name. And that was 1991. That's to give you the idea of the intensity of the hatred for this traitor to the class. And so, this is going to trigger in the fall of 1933 an attempted overthrow. Another term for coup is a putsch. The Wall Street putsch. There was an ultra-nationalistic group called the American Liberty League. But they were funded by some of the richest people in America, including the J.P. Morgan Jr. and members of the DuPont family who made it rich in chemicals, just getting incredibly rich. There might have been a couple Rockefellers involved. Henry Ford might have been involved in the periphery. And here's that's J.P. Morgan, that's Al Smith. And they were not only berating Roosevelt for being a socialist, as they saw, they thought he was destroying the country. And they hit the realization, they had the realization to themselves. Clearly, this Democratic experiment has failed. We never liked these people voting anyways, we got to get rid of it. And they looked to the person they admired, and they wanted to create a government like him. As they saw, this person was perfect. He allowed for monopolies, he called his government corporatist, he got rid of labor unions. His name was Benito Mussolini. And that's who they wanted, and that's who they idolized. They wanted fascism, which is kind of financialized monopoly. And here's Benito. Here's Benito marching on Rome, surrounded by World War I veterans in 1925, all dressed in nice black uniforms. They called themselves the Black Shirts. The richest people in Italy funded this. And he intimidated the king and took power. And they thought, that's what we'll do. If we can find an army and find a general who's popular and then become our figurehead, he can intimidate Roosevelt, take over, and create a fascist dictatorship. In fact, they created a new cabinet department they called the Department of the Homeland. Have you heard of the Department of Homeland Security? That's why when they created that after 9/11, 2001, it gave me shivers. Like, you really want to have a Department of Homeland? That was the attempted overthrow of the government. Do you guys know an example of perhaps a march on Washington, D.C. by veterans of World War I? Could that have happened? What was that called? Do you remember? The Bonus Army. If they could recondition a bonus army, now feed them and get them uniforms and find a popular general, and I showed you him there, Smedley Butler, right there. And they went to General Butler, who spoke, supporting the bonus army, and said, would you be willing to lead this, overthrow the government, and you'll be the dictator, we'll be behind the scenes. And Butler heard them out and immediately went to Roosevelt. He hated those people. He's the one who, in his book, said that he was a gangster for the Wall Street banks when he was in big stick diplomacy, when he won all his medals in Nicaragua and Haiti. He hated those people. So here he is. This is him. They had a newsreel where he is telling about this plot. All these people fled the country, by the way. And they called the weird, awkward Roosevelt plot. That's an article from it. This terrified Roosevelt. And his first instinct was to have them all rounded up and arrested for treason. And then he decided, and I don't know if this is the right idea, but he decided we can't arrest them all. If we arrest some of the wealthiest people in America because they want to overthrow a popularly elected government, that might crash the whole thing. It was still 33. The worst year of the Depression was just 6 or 7, but the worst time of the Depression was just 6 months ago. This might blow up the whole country. So they decided to not arrest them. There were a few committee hearings, and most of them kind of, the DuPonts came back and things like that. I was wondering, they committed treason. Kind of almost let them get away with it. And so after that, the conservative opposition would be huge to Roosevelt. They gave a lot of money to Roosevelt's political opponent, like in 1936. But this was a real attempt at a coup. It is one of the great what-ifs in history. What if they would have found a general, somebody who was popular, who did not have the qualities? Douglas MacArthur was chief of staff. Remember the one who used troops to put down the bonus army? He would have done it. Probably, I'm guessing, but he would have, oh, let me phrase that. He would have been a perfect candidate. But he had just been caught having an extramarital affair. And in the United States military, that is a breach of your code of conduct for an officer. And he was court-martialed. To this day, if an officer has an extramarital affair, he'll be court-martialed. And then they bring him back out of desperation in 41. So it's one of the great what-ifs in history. We might have had a fascist government. Would that have been exciting? That's really scary, I would argue. So, with that, and then profits started going up. And when profits started going up, opposition to the New Deal was still intense, but not quite as broad. We're kind of making money again. Let's see where this goes. And so ironically, the Republican who would be nominated in 36 was more like, we like some of the New Deal, but we can do it better. That's kind of amazing how fast it took. And then we have to get to one more thing. We didn't quite get there. So, also, Father Coughlin, known as the radio priest. He had a show where initially he was for Roosevelt, using this new media radio where he had millions of listeners. Here he is at, I can't remember the field. It's where the Tigers used to play. Don't you? You know where the Tigers used to play till the 1970s, right? You don't know that? I used to know. It's got, as soon as everyone leaves, I'll remember. Oh, I know, it's meaningless. But now I want to know. So I can forget again. The first thing I remember, I was 2.5 years old. I forgot everything since. Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel
That's correct.
Axis policy.
That was good.
That's fine. Okay.
The big thing is, I just want you to understand the extent of it.
Right. Okay.
We'll see you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Right when you find work, and hang by your thumb. Huh? Is that it?
That's what it said when I looked it up.
That has to be it. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. You know, I mean, some people might get rich off it, but it's just pure speculative. There are going to be some people get really rich, but it will blow. It will blow. All these will blow. They will blow.
Anything like you're like, oh hey, it's here. Look at it. You'll be rich. I promise. Next.
Remember what booms are when there's a bubble, everything's going to be great.
You're like, oh yeah, this is great, and then it all.
And there are a lot of people who have more money than you know what to do with. And so they can invest in that, and they'll boost the price up, and then they'll get more. What I'm worried about are people who don't have a lot of money. And they like borrow, they go, oh, I'll buy this. What are you buying? I mean, I know. I don't know.
There was like whole family in the school and they were like running around. And they were the only ones in there.
So, back in the 1700s, people were literally investing in the Netherlands. They were gambling.
And it was like crowded.
7, 8, 9 times.
And they were literally like right next to each other.
Yeah. They call it key. It reminds me of key.
Jumping in the pool.
So I have an NFT to sell you. Might have lost one in and out.
And then a mall. Yeah, and then I got his hand, from Dillard's, and then I got like two shirts, I got earrings, and then I got two tiny squishmallows, and one had like slips of my color. Because it's
What have you done?
I literally caught it and then I dropped it.
So nearly caught it means you dropped it.
So yeah, but I caught it like we didn't practice this.
Do we get to the ah?
Yes.
Ah!
You
got it right out. Perfect. You do not want to go look at that.